Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are on Capitol Hill today talking about their efforts to shrink the size of the federal government. The pair are meeting with congressional leaders, including incoming Republican Senate Majority Leader John Thune. The Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, which they will lead, has ambitious goals. Among them, cutting $2 trillion from the federal budget and eliminating 2 million federal workers. Joining us to discuss this and more, Alex Gangitano, White House correspondent here at the Hill. You know, Alex, I found it interesting that some Democrats are joining the DOGE caucus. There are DOGE caucuses in both the House and the Senate. Are we to assume that maybe Democrats are saying there might be something to this?
Yeah, it is interesting. I remember when it was first introduced, Congressman Ro Khanna came out and said, well, maybe we can look at some defense cuts through this. I mean, I think Democrats are curious of how can we look at, we're open to cuts in the government, but how can it be cuts that we want to see, whereas I think a lot of Republicans don't want to touch defense spending. They want to touch maybe things like entitlement programs or these EV tax credits. And so I think the fact that we're seeing Democrats joining the caucus means that they're open to the discussion and want to have a voice. They want to have a seat at the table because instead of just ignoring this, maybe they can try to, put their impression on, what should be cut instead of just let Republicans and the Trump administration go at it. So it makes sense to me that Democrats want to join, and I think they're curious about what kind of cuts could be made.
That $2 trillion figure is just astronomical. Trump has said that he doesn't want to touch Medicare or Social Security. Medicaid spending total is less than $1 trillion, but a lot of that goes to like nursing homes and home health services. These are issues that are important not just to Democrats, but to Republicans as well. We've talked about this before, but I don't know, $2 trillion, where does all that money come from?
Yeah, that's the big question. I know we've talked about also, when you figure out, let's cut this part of spending on science research, well, that might affect jobs at a Republican members of Congress's district back home, and then there's going to be an issue with that. So everything, has maybe a human element to it that you don't want to see cut. I think it's going to be an ongoing conversation. It sounds maybe easier than it is to an Elon Musk, but when it comes down to what all these programs do and who they help, like you mentioned, nursing home spending, nobody wants to be the party that cuts money for nursing for the elder Americans. And then again, defense spending, Republicans don't want to see that. Maybe Democrats are open to it. So I think this conversation right now, we're in the very, very early phases of it. But when it comes down to the nitty gritty of what they're actually going to advise President-elect Trump to cut, I think it's going to take a while to get there.
You mentioned military spending. I about fell out of my chair when Elon Musk and Bernie Sanders were agreeing with each other on X about criticism of defense spending. Elon Musk has been on one over the F-35 program. But of course, defense contractors are spread out all across the country. Defense spending has been a Republican issue in the past. Is there a path to any consensus on that, or are the Republican hawks going to guard what they've traditionally protected? Right.
I mean, I think the way that D.C. has worked is that the Republican hawks defend what they protect that. But an Elon Musk figure who's, not your typical Republican, he wants to come in and shake things up.
The richest person in the world.
Richest person in the world. I think, if he's open to this kind of a thing and Senator Sanders agrees with him, who else is going to agree with him? I don't know. I mean, this is all something that's so new. But you're right. The traditional Republican war hawks do not want to see something like that cut.
Speaking of government spending, Fed Chair Jerome Powell had a warning this week that the U.S. is on an unsustainable fiscal path. $26 trillion in additional national debt since the year 2000. Went up higher during Trump, went up even higher during Biden. How do these things come into play when we talk about the national debt and deficit spending, when we're going to talk about extending these Trump tax cuts next year?
Yeah, Chair Powell has been warning for a while now how unsustainable all of this is. And I think what we're going to look at, we were just talking about the defense hawks. I think now the deficit hawks are going to come into play a lot because they will not want to see us in a situation that these tax cuts, if they try to fast track it, pass pass it through reconciliation in the Senate, and then it leads to a tick up in the deficit. And so I think as easy as it might sound, that Republicans have, the White House, the House, and the Senate. Of course, these tax cuts should be able to get extended. That was from Trump's first term. But at the end of the day, the deficit is something that a lot of Republicans are concerned about. So I think it is going to end up being negotiations on the Hill amongst the party. They don't really need Democrats on this one, but they're going to have to figure it out amongst themselves.
But with this razor-thin margin, I mean, you take away these three members of Congress, Republican members of Congress that are going to go work in the administration, or Matt Gaetz isn't going to be in Congress anymore. It's 217 seats. That's what they need to pass anything. Right. Even when it comes to something that is as Republican as cutting taxes, I mean, last Congress, Mike Johnson was using Democrats to get things done. Probably not an option now that Trump's in the White House. I mean, just let's talk about extending the tax cuts. I mean, should Republicans be concerned that they're actually going to be able to get the votes that they need, considering these different factions?
Right. And I think moderate Republicans are going to be the people to watch. Are they going to want to just, roll over and let whatever comes through reconciliation pass the House? But at the end of the day, also what we're seeing, I mean, it's an ongoing pattern, especially with these cabinet picks, is that a lot of Republicans now are saying whatever Trump wants, we'll give him, besides some of these very controversial picks. And we might see the same with the extension of the tax bill, that even the moderate Republicans don't want to put up the fight, don't want to, get primaried in 2 years because they stopped this huge legacy item of President-elect Trump, which is this tax bill, stop that from getting extended. But that's where we are right now, but long way to go until they actually get these negotiations done.
Could be an interesting power shift from the hardline conservatives that kind of ruled the House during the Biden administration to maybe the more moderate Republicans during the Trump administration. Alex Gangitano, White House correspondent here at The Hill. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
Today, California Representative Ro Khanna joined Ramaswamy and Stephen Olacara on the Hill's Rising to discuss the latest on the race for a new DNC chair and what the party's new leader needs to focus on as they rebuild.
But I think what's important is that they're fair so that we get the big super PAC money out, that they're connecting to the grassroots of the party. I think of my father, who after he retired, he was a Northampton Township committee person and then became chair. And they would organize things with plays, and they'd organize at firehouses to the community. That's the heart of the Democratic Party, not just the donor class and the consultant class. I want a chair who's going to build that in all 50 states.
To hear more of that conversation, check out today's Rising on the Hill's YouTube page. During his re-election campaign, Trump repeatedly pledged to end the conflict between Russia and Ukraine within 24 hours of taking office. And now Ukrainian officials are holding high-level talks with the incoming Trump administration even before President-elect Trump takes office. News Nation's Robert Sherman has the latest.
One of the central campaign promises President-elect Trump made on the trail was bringing down the tensions overseas and finding a way to sunset the war that is currently ongoing in Ukraine, nearing its 3-year mark. With the Wall Street Journal reporting that conversations already opening up between Kyiv and the transition team here in Mar-a-Lago. J.D. Vance reportedly part of those conversations, as well as Keith Kellogg, the president-elect's choice to be the special envoy to Ukraine and Russia, as well as Mike Waltz, who was his pick to be national security advisor. In terms of the strategy here for the Trump team, it's starting to become a bit more clear. A central focus is bringing both the Russians and the Ukrainians to the negotiating table as quickly as possible, potentially through diplomatic coercion if necessary. If Ukraine doesn't want to negotiate, that could mean diminishing the amount of aid going to the Ukrainians. If the Russians don't want to come to the table, well, that could mean upping the amount of aid going to the Ukrainians. In terms of objectives here, the Ukrainians making very clear exactly what they want. NATO membership. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky even having a conversation with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte today, re-upping that stance that he believes Ukraine belongs in NATO. In fact, when you hear what the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry said this week, it leaves little to mystery. They said, quote, "We will not settle for any alternatives, surrogates, or substitutes for Ukraine's full membership in NATO." And while President-elect Trump has said time and time again he wants to find a way to end that war in Ukraine, to this point, full-on NATO membership for the Ukrainians is something his team has not had much of an appetite for. Drew?
News Nation's Robert Sherman, thank you. There are reports at the U.S. southern border that more migrant children are arriving unaccompanied. News Nation reports that in just one day, authorities found more than 300 children without their parents or guardians at the border. In today's Political Minute, Blake Berman, host of The Hill on News Nation, breaks down the numbers behind the trend.
Unaccompanied children arriving at the southern border. I'm Blake Berman, host of The Hill on News Nation. At the country's border, a rising trend. Border agents encountering minors, kids without their parents, many of whom are being smuggled into the country. Now, News Nation's Allie Bradley reports that on Monday alone, U.S. authorities found 315 unaccompanied kids at the border. Now, those numbers have risen over the last decade. For example, back in 2015, there were a little more than 40,000 encounters with unaccompanied kids. Now, over the next few years, under Barack Obama and Donald Trump's administrations, the numbers then went up. During the pandemic, the number of unaccompanied children at the border fell substantially. But during the Biden administration, those numbers have jumped, as you can see. They peaked in 2022 with more than 152,000. I'm Blake Berman, and this is the News Nation Political Minute.
You can find more news and analysis from Blake and our colleagues 24/7 on News Nation. To find News Nation on your screen, go to joinnn.com. And that's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.